You can hear it lapping against the hull beneath your feet, soft, rhythmic, almost soothing, but your hands won't stop shaking. You're holding a silver pitcher of wine, Falernian, aged 15 years, worth more than your life. Around you, torches flicker across marble columns that should not exist on water. Fountains flow impossibly on a deck that stretches farther than some city streets. And at the center of it all, reclining on silk the color of dried blood, is the man who owns everything you can see, including you. Your name is Marcus. You were 17 when they bought you, 19 now, 2 years serving in the household of Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. The soldiers called him Caligula when he was a child running through military camps in tiny boots. Little boot, he's 27 now, and he's been emperor for 2 years. And in those 2 years, you've learned that some men, when given the power of gods, don't just abuse it. They reshape reality itself to fit appetites that have no names. Tonight, on this floating palace in the middle of Lake Nemi, you're about to understand just how far that reshaping can go. Before we descend into what happened on that lake hand, I need to tell you. Some of what you're about to hear has been deliberately hidden from history for 2,000 years, I have to say. It amazes me every time that people from Seoul to Sao Paulo, from Calgary to Cairo, all click on a story about ancient Rome and want to know the truth. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. It never gets old. The year is 39 CE, 20 miles south of Rome. Lake Nemi sits in a volcanic crater, dark and still. The locals call it Diana's Mirror. It's a sacred place surrounded by temples, a place where Roman families come to worship the goddess of the hunt. But for the past 6 months, construction has been underway that has nothing to do with worship. 2 ships are being built on the lake's surface, not boats, ships. The larger one measures 240 feet long, longer than most ocean-going vessels of the era. It has heated floors, running water, gardens on its deck, marble colonnades, and chambers below deck, whose purpose will become terrifyingly clear. These are not ships meant for travel. The lake is only 3 miles across. These are stages, theaters, places where the emperor can do things that cannot be done, in palaces where servants might whisper, where walls might remember, where the Senate might hear. Suetonius, writing decades later, with access to imperial records and eyewitness accounts, describes gatherings on these ships in language carefully chosen. He writes that senators' wives and daughters were invited to attend, that once aboard, they were inspected by the emperor like merchandise at auction, that what followed these inspections was conducted according to the emperor's direction, with assignments given, performances required, and refusal met with consequences that made death seem merciful. Cassius Dio, another historian working from different sources, confirms the pattern without providing explicit detail. He writes that Caligula's pleasures exceeded even what Rome had learned to expect from its worst rulers, a statement remarkable for what it implies about Roman tolerance. This was a civilization that watched people torn apart by animals for entertainment, that accepted slavery, conquest, and brutality as normal. And even they found what happened on those ships difficult to name. Marcus stands at his post near the wine vessels. He's been standing there for an hour, watching guests arrive by torchlight. He recognizes faces. Senator Valerius Catullus, whose speeches in the Forum are famous for their moral authority. The wife of Consul Gnaeus Domitius, known throughout Rome for her virtue and her family's ancient dignity. A priest from the Temple of Mars, his robes still bearing the sacred insignia of his office. All of them moving across the deck toward the emperor with expressions Marcus has learned to recognize: terror and something else underneath it. the exhausted acceptance of people who have run out of ways to protect themselves. The invitation to Caligula's lake gatherings is not optional. It arrives at your home delivered by Praetorian guards. It does not request your attendance, it informs you, and everyone in Rome understands what declining means. Your property seized, your family accused of conspiracy, your name erased from every public record as though you had never existed. Or worse, much worse, your family invited in your place. So you go, you dress in your finest clothing, you smile, and you pray to gods who seem to have stopped listening. What makes Caligula different from other tyrants and history has produced many is not simply his cruelty, it's his creativity, his systematic exploration of what absolute power makes possible. Other emperors killed for political reasons. Caligula killed for curiosity. Other emperors took what they wanted. Caligula invented new categories of wanting. He approached depravity the way a philosopher approaches questions of truth, methodically, experimentally, pushing each boundary to find the next one. The floating palace itself reveals this methodical approach. Archaeologists recovered both ships from Lake Nemi in the 1930s, draining the lake to reach them after 19 centuries underwater. What they found exceeded even the ancient descriptions. The larger vessel featured engineering that shouldn't have been possible: a lead pipe system that provided running water throughout the ship, a heating system using the same hypocaust technology as Roman baths, and chambers whose purpose became clear only when their dimensions were compared with ancient texts describing what occurred inside them. Small rooms, barely large enough for a couch, with fixtures mounted on walls in configurations that naval architects found inexplicable until historians suggested their function, with floors that sloped towards drains not for seawater but for easier cleaning after use, with soundproofing in the walls, layers of cork and fabric that would muffle any noise from within. One chamber in particular disturbed the excavation team enough that its contents were not fully catalogued. The room was circular, approximately 12 feet in diameter, with bronze rings set into the walls at various heights. The floor was marble, stained in patterns that chemical analysis later identified as human blood, absorbed into stone over repeated exposure. And in the center of the room was a drain large enough to dispose of objects significantly larger than water. Marcus doesn't know about that chamber yet. He's still on deck, pouring wine for guests who accept cups with hands that tremble despite their attempts at composure. The emperor is speaking now, his voice carrying easily across the water in the still night air. He's talking about divinity, about how the gods experience pleasure without constraint, about how Jupiter took any form he desired to pursue his appetites: swan bull, golden rain, about how divine nature means freedom from mortal limitations. It's a speech Marcus has heard variations of before. It always comes before the assignments. Caligula rises from his couch. He's not physically imposing by average height, thin build, balding despite his youth. But when he moves, everyone's eyes follow. He walks among the guests slowly, stopping before each one. Sometimes he touches a face, turning it toward the torchlight. Sometimes he simply looks, his expression unreadable. Sometimes he speaks a comment on beauty, on posture, on some physical attribute that catches his attention. A woman in her 40s, wife to a senator who served under Tiberius, begins quietly weeping as the emperor approaches. He stops in front of her, studies her tears with apparent fascination, then reaches out and touches her cheek, collecting moisture on his fingertip. He tastes it, considers, then moves on without speaking. The woman's weeping intensifies, not from relief, but from the certainty that being passed over tonight means being selected next time. The assignments begin. The emperor speaks names, sometimes 2, sometimes 3 or 4 together. Those named rise and follow attendants toward doors leading below deck. Some walk steadily, others need to be supported. One young man, barely 20, turns back toward his father, seated among the guests. The look they exchange contains everything that cannot be spoken. Then the young man disappears through the doorway, and his father stares at his hands as though they belong to someone else. Marcus refills cups. It's all he can do. Keep moving, stay useful, remain invisible. Survival depends on being necessary but forgettable present, but somehow absent, there but not quite there. What happened in those below-deck chambers has been preserved in fragments across multiple ancient sources, none willing to describe it fully. Suetonius writes that Caligula arranged combinations that violated every social and religious boundary Rome recognized, that he required performances from noble Romans that would carry the death penalty if conducted by anyone else, that he watched with the attention of a man studying philosophy, taking notes, offering direction, occasionally participating himself. Cassius. Dio adds that the emperor's innovations included what he called sacred unions, sexual acts framed as religious ritual, with participants dressed in costume representing gods and mythological figures. Dio notes that even temples dedicated to Venus, whose worship included elements modern observers would consider sexual, found Caligula's religious framings blasphemous. When priests objected, they were informed that the emperor, as a living god, could define what was sacred. 3 priests who continued objecting were invited to the lake. Only one returned, and he never spoke publicly again. But perhaps the most disturbing detail preserved in ancient sources concerns consent, or rather the absence of it, and the way that absence was disguised. Participants in Caligula's gatherings were required not just to comply, but to perform willingness, to smile, to simulate enthusiasm, to act as though what was happening was their choice. Guards would monitor faces, and those whose expressions revealed too much disgust or distress would be noted. The consequences for failing to perform convincingly were severe enough that most people learned quickly. The cruelty of this requirement forcing victims to become actors in their own violations served multiple purposes. It protected Caligula legally, since technically participants appeared willing. It created psychological damage beyond the physical acts themselves, and it made recovery afterward nearly impossible because victims couldn't even claim pure victimhood. They had smiled, they had performed, they carried guilt alongside trauma. A senator named Lucius Vitellius attended multiple late gatherings and survived to serve under subsequent emperors. Late in life, apparently suffering from dementia, he was heard speaking to himself in a villa garden, repeating the phrase, "I had no choice," over and over while weeping. When attendants tried to comfort him, he would ask them, "But I smiled, didn't I? I smiled." No one knew what he meant. The historical record suggests they knew better than to ask. By midnight, the assignments have been completed. Most guests have returned from below deck, their clothing adjusted, their faces carefully neutral. They sit in designated areas, speaking to no one, staring at nothing. A few have not returned yet. Marcus doesn't know if that means they're still occupied with their assignments or if something else has happened. The emperor calls for entertainment. Musicians begin playing. Dancers perform. Food is brought out, elaborate dishes that guests pick at without appetite. Caligula reclines on his couch, apparently satisfied, occasionally summoning an individual guest to his side for quiet conversation. These conversations are brief. The guest returns to their seat looking relieved or terrified, or sometimes both. At some point during the night, Marcus will never remember exactly when there's a commotion near one of the doorways leading below deck. Guards disappear through it. Voices are raised, then suddenly silent. After several minutes, the guards return and resume their positions as though nothing has occurred. The emperor doesn't react. The musicians continue playing, but everyone on deck understands that someone below has done something that required intervention. Later, when guest tallies are compared against arrival records, 3 names will be unaccounted for. Official records will list their deaths as occurring elsewhere from natural causes. Their families will bury empty coffins and never speak of what they suspect. Dawn begins to lighten the eastern sky around the 5th hour. The emperor rises, announces that the gathering has been successful, and thanks his guests for honoring him with their presence, as though this was a normal dinner party, as though everyone hadn't just lived through experiences that will haunt them for decades. Guards escort guests back to boats that will ferry them to shore. Marcus is ordered to remain aboard and begin cleaning. The cleaning reveals what the darkness had hidden: torn clothing in corners, wine mixed with other fluids on marble floors. In one of the garden areas, someone has been sick repeatedly, leaving evidence of physical breakdown that no amount of forced performance could disguise. Marcus works methodically, dumping refuse into the lake, scrubbing stains, restoring the floating palace to pristine condition. It takes hours. Other slaves work alongside him, and none of them speak. What would they say? They're witnesses to imperial activities that carry death sentences, if discussed. Their survival depends on becoming machines present but unthinking, seeing but not remembering. Years later, after Caligula's assassination, Marcus will be interviewed by historians gathering information about the reign. He'll provide details about the ships, about the gatherings, about procedures and protocols. But when asked what specifically happened in those below-deck chambers, he'll shake his head and say only, "I cleaned afterward." That's how I know the historians will press for detail, but Marcus will remain silent, and eventually they'll move on to other witnesses. What he saw in those chambers while cleaning the evidence left behind, the equipment that had been used, the state of rooms where nobles had been assigned is preserved only in his silence. The pattern that Caligula established on Lake Nemi continued throughout his 4-year reign. The floating palaces were used regularly, approximately twice monthly according to records. Guest lists varied, but certain individuals appeared repeatedly, suggesting either that they had become favorites or that their continued summons was itself a punishment. Some guests died by suicide between gatherings. Their deaths were officially attributed to personal troubles, financial difficulties, illness. But the timing often, within days of a lake gathering, suggests other causes. What makes the Lake Nemi operation significant in the larger pattern of Caligula's reign is its systematic nature. This wasn't impulsive depravity. This was organized, recurring, methodically executed. The ships required maintenance, staff required training, guests required transportation, supplies required procurement. An entire infrastructure existed to support gatherings, whose sole purpose was satisfying appetites that recognized no moral boundaries. The infrastructure reveals something that simple stories of mad emperors miss. Caligula's crimes required cooperation. Hundreds of people knew what was happening: guards, slaves, ship crews, palace administrators, suppliers who provided the wine and food and special equipment. All of them participated, not because they approved, but because refusing meant joining the victims. The system perpetuated itself through fear, creating complicity that made resistance nearly impossible. You couldn't oppose Caligula without implicating yourself in what you'd already helped facilitate. When the Praetorian Guard finally assassinated Caligula in January of 41 CE, one of the first acts of the new Emperor Claudius was ordering the Lake Nemea ships destroyed. They were deliberately sunk, weighted with stones, hidden beneath 40 feet of water. The official explanation was that they represented excessive spending. The real reason was that they represented something Rome needed to forget. As long as those ships existed, they were evidence of what imperial power could become. Sinking them was an attempt to sink the memory. But memory doesn't sink that easily. The ship's existence was recorded in multiple sources. Their dimensions were preserved. Descriptions of their use survived in fragments across different texts. And when Mussolini drained the lake 16 centuries later, driven by fascist dreams of reclaiming Roman glory, what emerged from the mud was proof that every terrible story had been true. The ships were exactly as large as sources claimed. The chambers below deck existed as described. The engineering was as sophisticated as ancient authors had documented. And in the silt inside those chambers, archaeologists found bones, human bones, from multiple individuals, some bearing marks that forensic analysis identified as consistent with violent trauma. The bones were not from passengers who died naturally. They were from people who died aboard and whose bodies were disposed of through methods that left skeletal evidence. How they died, why they died, what they experienced before dying, remains unknown. The bones tell us only that some who attended Caligula's gatherings on Lake Nemi never left alive. Those bones were cataloged, photographed, and stored in a museum built beside the lake to house the recovered ships. During World War II, the museum burned. Some historians believe retreating German forces set the fire deliberately. Others think it was accidental. The ships were destroyed completely, reduced to ash. Most of the artifacts were lost. The bones disappeared, their location in storage areas meaning they were consumed completely by fire, which means the final physical evidence of what happened on those floating palaces is gone. We have only the ancient texts, the archaeological reports from the 1930s excavation, and the testimony of a few witnesses who survived to tell fragments of what they experienced or heard about from others. Marcus survived. He lived to approximately 60 years old, dying in 82 CE during the reign of Domitian. A funerary inscription discovered in 1873 identifies him as Marcus Aurelius Privatus, freedman, servant in the household of the divine Gaius. The inscription includes an unusual line, "May the gods grant me peace in death which I could not find in life." Standing beside Lake Nemi today, you wouldn't know any of this happened. The water is peaceful. The surrounding hills are covered with trees. The temples are ruins, tourist attractions, places where visitors come to appreciate ancient architecture without thinking too deeply about what those temples witnessed.